Hello, my name is Carl Brown. I'm one of the ministers at North Highlands Baptist Church. I'm so glad you could join me today. We're here at my home. We're getting ready for another backyard Bible study. We've been going through the book of 1 Samuel. So if you would, get out your copy of the Word of God and let's get right into the Word. Our lesson today is David in Exile, Part 2. We covered David having to leave into exile because King Saul, was trying to kill him. His father-in-law, the king of Israel, the first anointed king of Israel, was trying to kill him. And so Jonathan told him that, and so he fled from him, and he picked up a band of merry men, actually. He ended up picking up about 600 men that were going around with him, and he still fought the battles of the Lord, but Saul was pursuing him with 3,000 of the best troops of Israel, again, putting aside all pretense and trying to kill David. And I forget how many times we're up to now, 8, 9 times that we have record of that Saul tried to kill David, and God protected his life, and David kept his integrity when it came to his treatment of Saul. Well, today we continue with David in exile. And we are in chapter 26, and I told you last week that we were going to go through chapter 31 and finish the book, but we're not going to do that. I apologize. We're going to go through chapter 30, and we'll finish the book next week as we get into 2 Samuel, because chapter 31 goes really well with 2 Samuel, and so we'll do that next week. But this is David in Exile, Part 2, chapters 26 through 30 of 1 Samuel. Well, the first thing that happens is basically, here we go again. These people came and they told him, hey, we know where David is. And so Saul takes his 3,000 men, his choice men, and takes his commander, Abner. Remember that name, it'll become more important later. It takes his commander of his armies, Abner, and 3,000 men, and he takes off after David again, and he starts looking for him. Verse 2, it says, so Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with his 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search there for David. So here they are searching for David again, and it's going to take them days, weeks. I don't know how long it is that they are there looking for David. But because they're there so long, they have to spend the night several times, and they bed down, they have a camp. And it's about to talk about that camp. Now, typically in a military camp, the most important person, the VIP, is in the center of the camp, whether it be the general or the king. In this case, it's both. The king and the general are in the very center of the camp, and surrounding them are their best men, surrounded by another group of men. All the rest of the tents are set out in a circle or in a column that comes out from the center of camp, and they put sentries or watch people all around the camp to keep their enemies at bay. But David goes out to meet Saul this time, and I'm not sure what his true intent was immediately. Maybe it's just to keep a good eye on him, to know where he's at. But we're going to pick up and we're going to read the story of what happens one night while Saul and Abner and his men are all bedded down for the night. Verse 5. Then David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of the army, had lain down. Saul was lying inside the camp with the army encamped around him. Then David asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, or son of somebody, Joab's brother, who will go down into the camp with me to Saul? Now this is a big question, because obviously he's going down in the middle of the night. They're sneaking into the camp. That's a big deal. That's a real scary thing to do. But Abishai says, I'll go with you. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul, lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't have to strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him either in his time will come, or he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and water jug that are near his head, and let's go." Just picture this. Here David is, literally in enemy territory, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the camp, right next to Saul and Abner, where the greatest guard is, and he's having a conversation. Him and Abishai are having this conversation right there. Abishai wants to kill Saul, and David's like, no, we're not going to kill him. And Abishai's like, why are we here if we're not going to kill him? Just get his spear in his jug. Go get his water in his jug and his spear, and let's get out of here. Oh, I don't know. It's just crazy that they were sitting there having a conversation in the middle of the camp, and I'm sure Abishai was extremely confused. Verse 12, "So David took the spear and the water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep." Well, that's the good explanation. So the Lord put them into a deep sleep. But Abishai and David didn't know that. Either they were brave, courageous, daring, stupid. I don't know what you want to call it. But anyhow, he had done this, and God protected him by keeping all the men in a deep sleep. So what does David do once he gets the spear in his water jug? He mocks Abner. He gets very far away. He stands on a hill some distance away where there's a distance between them, I guess out of bowshot range, and he starts yelling, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" And Abner replies, "Who are you who calls to the king?" Couldn't tell who he was from the distance. And then David mocks him. He says in verse 15, "You're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard the Lord the king? Someone came to destroy the Lord the king. What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?" And again, just like with the cloak that was cut, they're looking around and they see that the spear and water jug are gone. They look at David, they see he has the spear and the water jug, and their hearts must have just like, "Oh, are you kidding me? Again?" And Saul recognized David's voice and says, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" I just want to say, Saul is probably 70 years old here. He's real close to 70 years old here. And he probably couldn't see. He probably couldn't see David. This is the second time that he's been in this situation. And both times he's asked if that's David's voice. He didn't recognize David. He recognizes his voice. So I'm thinking Saul was having real trouble with his eyesight. That's not important at all. Let's continue with the story. David replied, "Yes, it is, my lord the king. And why is my lord pursuing his servant?" David basically just asked Saul, "Here we are again, Saul. I am proving to you that I am not out to harm you. And I'm just saying, if your men are telling you that I'm out to harm you, they're wrong. Look, I've got your spear, I got your jug. I'm not going to harm you. May the Lord judge between you and me." And he kind of repeats the same thing that we went over last week. And Saul once again confesses and realizes his great sin and that David has spared his life. Look in verse 21. Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you considered my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and erred greatly." So Saul confesses that he's been wrong, that David has been right. So once again, Saul came out to kill David, to destroy him, and the Lord delivered Saul into David's hands, and he spared him. And Saul confesses that he is being sinful, he's out of the Lord's will, and then he blesses David. He gives him another blessing right here. And but I want you to really catch what David did. David here gives us something. This is our first great lesson for today. David gives us an early version of what we call the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule was given to us by Jesus in the New Testament. He says, do to others as you want done unto you. Treat others the way that you want to be treated. It's repeated in several different ways throughout the Bible. To love thy neighbor as yourself. And so it's considered one of the greatest commandments, to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. But here we see David actually living it out. Look in verse 24. He says, as surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. David treated Saul literally the way that he wanted to be treated. And he lived it out. And it was not easy for David. David was an outlaw. He was living off the land. He was a bunch of 600 bad guys that all came to him, and he was leading this band of marauders, outlaws, all around the land. And he had no place to rest his head. Was sleeping in caves, sleeping outside, and yet the greatest king, his father-in-law and the greatest power in the land was trying to kill him. And how does he respond to that? In the most difficult of circumstances, David treats Saul the way that he wanted to be treated. That's a great lesson for us today. We are in a country that is absolutely divided. We're divided spiritually, we're divided politically, and we're getting back to tribalism where we're divided even ethnically and culturally. And instead of being a melting pot, it's become a land of division. And in social media, in the streets, on television, political parties, it's just a great divide, and it keeps getting worse and worse. And one of the reasons for that is because we are not following the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is simply to treat others the way you want to be treated. Treat them, if you want respect, treat them with respect. If you want dignity, treat them with dignity. If you want to be loved, then treat them with love. If you want peace, then treat them with peace. And we're not doing it. Instead, what's happening is a lot of us in our own lives, but certainly nationally, we're treating other people the way that we've been treated. Well, you've been calling me names, I'm going to call you names. You've been oppressing me, I'm going to oppress you. You've been fighting against me, I'm going to fight against you. You're going to destroy something of mine, I'm going to destroy something of yours. And when we meet hate with hate, there will never be a good outcome. Hate met with hate will always lead to violence. And the only peace that comes with hate versus hate is when one side is absolutely destroyed. Is that what we want? Do we want the kind of peace that only comes after a war? Or do we want a peace that changes the hearts of men? Because war doesn't even change the heart of men. If we want a peace that comes from changing the hearts of men, then we are going to meet hate with love. And it may take longer. It's going to be a whole lot harder. But in the end, that hate can be changed and that heart can be changed. And there is a real peace and a real moving forward and real progress in life. And that is all learned from right here. David did not want there to be a forever division between him and Saul's family, between him and the people of Israel. He didn't want that. So he was met with Saul's hate, and he met it with loyalty and love. And that is a great lesson for us. It's a great lesson in your individual life, in your professional life, and certainly in our public lives. We need to meet hate with love. And I want to even challenge you here. That's also the lesson in your private, inner mind and heart. Meet hate with love. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Great lesson. All right, well, Saul blessed David, forgave David, told David that he would never try to kill him again. And actually, this time he kept that promise. But did David trust Saul? Absolutely not. That's a whole different matter. David didn't trust Saul, and he even says there in verse 1 of chapter 27, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. He says the best thing I can do to get some rest is to go into the land of my enemy because Saul won't come after me there. And so he did. He went and he served the Achish, the king of Gath, one of the southern Philistine towns. And so he goes there, and he's living there with the king, and the king finally gives him some land. He gives him Ziklag, a town, and him and his 600 actually go there, and they bring their wives and children and their plunder, and they settle there kind of for a while. It becomes their base. Ziklag does. It becomes a city of David. And but they are still warriors, and they still do what warriors do. They're like really akin to a band of Vikings. They have a leader. They have 600 men, and they would go out and they would attack these towns, and they would totally destroy them and kill all the men and women, and then they would bring all the plunder back to their house. Now they did that quite a bit, and Achish was beginning to wonder, the king of Gath. He's like, hey, well, who are you attacking? Where are you getting all this plunder? And David flat out lied. He said, well, we're going and attacking these small outer towns of Israel and Judah and bringing the plunder back from there. But that's not all what David was doing. David was attacking the town, the tribes of the Amalekites and the Gizites that were between the Philistines and Israel and Egypt, the ones that were supposed to be annihilated by Saul. And he didn't. So David's going and doing it, and he's raiding these parties, and they're keeping their warrior skills sharp. But because he's lied to Achish, and he's always coming back with plunder, Achish is beginning to trust David a lot, a real misfound trust in David. And we see that in the last verse of the chapter 27. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant forever. So Achish thinks that he's went from being the hero of Israel to the villain, and they hate him. He's going to be with me forever. I've really lucked out in getting David. Nothing could be further from the truth. But all that is put to the test in chapter 28. In chapter 28, all the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. And Achish says to David, you understand, you are going to come with me. You're going to fight with my army. And David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. And Achish replied, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. He gives him the highest place of honor to guard the king. And it looks like David's about to go attack Israel and Judah with Achish, the king. Now, what was in David's heart? What was going through his mind at this point? I don't know. Was he planning on betraying Achish? I don't know. But it looks like he was about to join the Philistines in attacking Israel. We'll come back to that in a minute. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, in Israel, Saul is scared to death that all the Philistines have come together to attack, and he doesn't have Samuel to go to and ask about this. He doesn't have anyone he feels he can trust to seek the Lord's favor. Let's look and see what he does. Verse 5 of 28. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him. By dreams or by Urim, that's the casting lots, or by prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go inquire of her. There is one in Endor, they said. Endor? Isn't that where the Ewoks live and where Luke and Leia and Han Solo were able to fight the Empire and destroy the Death Star? Isn't that where Endor is? Oh, no. I'm sorry. That's the moon of Endor. That must be... Sorry. Sci-fi joke. All right, well, what is a medium? What is Saul looking for here? Well, a medium is somebody who speaks with the dead. It's someone that we would call today a psychic, someone who spoke with spirits of the dead. They would do a seance, and they would call up spirits of the dead to talk to. And it's an evil thing. It's an absolute abomination to the Lord. And Saul, in his early years, when he was really following the Lord, had made them, had banished them, or killed them, or removed them, had made it against the law, and so he had eradicated them from all of Israel. But now, his prophets aren't answering him, the Lord's not answering him, and he can't get an answer, and so he is desperate, and he's full of fear, so he has his guys find one. All right, well, let's see what happens. We're about to get into a real seance that happened in the Bible. Verse 8. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes at night, and he and the two men went to the woman. Consult the spirit for me, he said, and I will bring up for me the one I name. But the woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritualists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this. Then the woman asked, whom shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. Saul was truly desperate if he brought up Samuel, a prophet of the Lord, through a medium, an abomination to the Lord, to get the Lord's answer as to whether or not he should attack his enemies. That's wrong. That's guts. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. She knew immediately then. The king said to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? Then the woman said, I see a spirit coming up out of the ground. What does he look like? He asked. An old man wearing a robe is coming up, she said. Sounds like a ghost story, doesn't it? Well, it's because it is. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I am in great distress, said Saul. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do. Samuel said, why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone. That did not go the way that Saul thought it would. Can you imagine? My goodness, he goes through witchcraft and to find out the answer from the Lord, and brings up the ghost of Samuel, and Samuel does not tell him what he wants to hear. He flat out says, Saul, you're an idiot, you're a failure, you're an enemy of the Lord, and you know what? You're a walking dead man, because tomorrow you're going to be with me, and not only you, your sons as well. Well, I don't think that could have went worse for Saul. So that kind of brings me to a little side note, a little lesson here for you to keep in your mind. Do not go to something that God considers wicked and an abomination to seek the Lord's will. Don't go to psychics, don't go through astronomy, don't go through mediums, don't go through witches or witchcraft or sorcery or anything of the sort to try to seek the Lord's will. Because if you're seeking it that way, you're already out of his will and an enemy of God. That's very important to keep in mind. You have to remember that the spirit world is a real thing, that we don't just fight forces of flesh and bone and that we can see and hear and taste and touch, that there is a spiritual realm, and there's angels and there are demons, fallen angels that are ruled by Satan. And when you get into that kind of stuff, you're inviting them to be a part of your life and to manipulate you and to use you. You don't want anything to do with that. But here's the cool thing. If you're a child of God, they have no power over you, because who has power over them? The King of Kings and Lord of Lords has dominion over all things that we can see and can't see, above the ground, below the ground, everywhere. And so he rules and he reigns. And in this instance, he uses this particular seance to give warning to Saul and to tell him it's all over, just to tell him it's over. And that's not the only time that God has used something heathen to get his point across. Remember Balaam, the prophet for hire, that told Balak the will of God when he tried to get him to curse Israel? Remember him talking through a donkey? He's used those things before. God can use anything, and so he will, and he did in this case. But keep that in mind. Always remember that. Do not do something that is out of God's will to learn God's will, ever. All right. I told you we'd get back to David, and we did. And now we're in chapter 29, and the Philistines are all gathered together, and now the Philistines are like, whoa, wait a minute, Achish. Is that David? Is that David with you? Look at verse 4. It says, but the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, send the men back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands? That must have been a catchy tune. Saul killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. I wonder how it was put to music, because this is like the third or fourth time it's been brought back up. Not only do the people remember the song, but their enemies certainly remember the song, and they're not having any of this David going with that. And they may have been right. David may have turned. He may have felt guilty. He may have done something. He may have thought he could get back in Saul's good graces. He may have turned and given Israel a great victory that day instead of fighting against God's people. But that's not what I think. I truly believe this is another Abigail moment. Do you remember last week we talked about how Abigail fell on her face before David and kept him from going and killing Nabal and all the men that served Nabal? That she kept him from innocent bloodshed and for doing something that's an abomination to the Lord? I think this is another Abigail moment, except this time it is Achish, the king of Israel, and the king of Gath, and the kings of the Philistines who come before David and tell him, no, you're not going to go do this. And David was sent another way. God kept David once again from doing a very sinful and wrong thing. And it may have been David's pride trying to prove himself. I don't know what it was in David's mind, but it seems like David was set on fighting with them. But God kept him from it and sent him the other way. And thank God that he did. I'm glad he did, because this would have driven a divide between Israel and David. And that is exact opposite of what needed to happen. Remember, God was already about to take care of Saul. He had just told us, not David, but he told us that, told Saul through Samuel's ghost, that he was about to die. And so David need not be in part of that battle, because we go against everything he'd been trying to build. So once again, David had a good moment and a bad moment. And that brings us to our last chapter today, chapter 30. So David and his men went back to Ziklag, and when they got there, they found a terrible sight. Ziklag had been burned to the ground, and all of their families, their wives and children, and all the things that they owned had been taken and stolen by a raiding party of the Amalekites, the same Amalekites that Saul was supposed to destroy years and years ago, but he didn't. Well, they were opportunists. They saw that the Philistines had all gathered together, and the Israelites and Judah had all gathered together, and they were about to fight each other. So they took this opportunity to go and to raid the southern towns of Israel and Judah and the southern towns of the Philistines, and they had. And they burned it like to the ground, and they took all the wealth, and they were returning back to wherever they came from. And boy, did they grieve. And these men were crying, and they were even talking about stoning David. These were not the best kind of guys. And so David did the right thing. David got Abiathar, the priest, remember him, and he had him seek the Lord for him, and they prayed. And we get to verse 8, and it says, David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, the Lord answered. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. So David and the 600 men with him came to Bezor Raven, where some stayed behind, for 200 men were too exhausted to cross the ravine. But David and the 400 men continued pursuit. They found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. So there was this ravine, Bezor Ravine. 200 were too exhausted. I don't get that, but they were. 200 stayed behind with all their stuff, and it allowed the 400 to move forward with just their weapons and their horses, where they could overtake the raiding party. And they come across this Egyptian, and he ends up being a slave of one of the Amalekites, and he was sick, and they had left him for dead. And so they get him to squeal by promising him that they won't kill him and they won't return him to his master. And so this Egyptian leads them directly to the raiding party. And when they catch up to him, we get there in verse 17. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except 400 young men who rode off in camels and fled. Well, this gives us a clue to how big the party was, because the escape was only 400 people who left, and it says only 400 people left. So it was a whole lot more than that they were fighting against, yet David was only fighting with 400 men. So him and his 400 men destroyed an entire raiding army of men. For 24 hours they fought until 400 of them got away on their camels. And the Lord obviously gave David another tremendous victory against all odds. In verse 18, David recovered everything from the Amalekites, everything they had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder from anything that they had taken. So no one had died in the experience. Everything came back. Everything that was taken came back. It was a great God-given victory, and David recognized that. Now, they had more than what was taken from them. They had all the plunder from the other cities, but the men separated that and said, that's David's. That's our leader's. He gets all of that. Wow. Verse 21, David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at Bezor Ravine. They came out to meet David and the people with him. As David and his men approached, he greeted them. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they didn't go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. So these troublemakers weren't going to give them anything because they weren't there for the fight. And then the next thing that David does is our last lesson from the day. It's a really neat thing. No, my brothers, he says, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed us over to the forces that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the men who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to do the battle. All share alike. David made this a statute and an ordinance for Israel from that day to this. And when David arrived in Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah and Israel. And he said, here's a present from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. And as we read down, it's in the last verse there, is to those and other places where David and his men had roamed. David did an incredible thing here. He says, we will not forget those who are a part of our success. These 200 men stayed behind, but they stayed behind with our supplies. We are one. We may have went ahead and we may get the glory for winning the battle, but these guys were our support cast and they helped us in that. We are all part of the same group. And so we're all going to get the same share because the Lord is the one who really truly gave us the victory. But he did more than that. It's in his mind racing. It's in him thinking about all the people who had helped him over these last few years from Judah. I mean, he was an outlaw with 600 men. And all these different places in Judah, these elders had helped him. These cities had given them food, had sheltered them. And he was remembering that. Nabal, we remember last time, didn't. But all these others had, and for years they had. So David wisely, with great leadership skills, divided the plunder and sent it to all these people who had helped him over the last few years, saying, this is a gift from the Lord's enemies. Thank you. It's a thank you gift for what you have done for us, supporting me and my men. Here's the lesson. Be good to your supporting cast, just like David was. Every time I watch a movie, I'm always blown away at the end of the movie when the credits come up. And they give everybody credit. It's amazing. It must be a law about it, but they give everybody credit. And the credits themselves can take up to 10 minutes of showing the hundreds and thousands of people who actually were all a part of that one movie, that one 2.5 hour experience that you just had. All these people were a part of that. And they're recognizing that all of those people had a part in the experience that you just enjoyed. And it shows them all. It shows them from the stunt doubles to the gaffer. What's a gaffer? A gaffer is a guy who just tapes down wires. He gets his name on the list. And it starts with the main characters, the people you recognize, the people you see. You know, I have the same kind of thing as a worship leader. I lead worship at our church at North Highlands. And we can have a great day of worship. And a lot of times when we have a great day of worship, people will come up and they tell me that I did a good job, which, you know, I'm grateful for. But I'm really nothing without the supporting cast that I have. I have these incredible musicians who give of their time and their talent. I have great singers that sing with me and lead with me on the stage. I have a wonderful choir that backs us up and really raises the roof in worship. At the same time, I've got sound men and incredible sound equipment that kind of makes it all sound right and makes it all happen. And I've got someone who's running overheads for us all to see and to keep it smooth and for everybody to be able to stay together. And I got a cameraman who's recording. I got another person who is streaming it. And all those people work together for that one ministry to happen. And I'm really nothing without them. All of us have people that help us. We all have people that help us be in the situation that we're in. People that have helped educate us, people who have helped raise us, people who have helped inspire us, Abigails that were put in our path. All these different people, bosses to support staff, all of them are a part of who we are and a part of all of our accomplishments. And so my lesson today that I want me and us to take from this is find those people and be grateful to them. Say thank you to them this week, just like David did. That's a great lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, I'm not going to get in chapter 31. I'm not going to finish the book because chapter 31 really leads us into 2 Samuel. And so next week we're going to look at chapter 31 and the first 4 chapters of 2 Samuel, which is the end of Saul and the rise of David. And we have these a lot of conflict next week. So read ahead and be ready. I hope you enjoyed our lesson this week. I sure have enjoyed having you with me here at our home. And I'll see you next week.